April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Coxside, France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Rolf Herrmichen's smirk as he watched the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 19 A5. The veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26 studied the American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. His radio crackled with the voice of his wingman. "By God, Herr Oberleutnant, they have sent us flying milk bottles!" Herrmission couldn't suppress his laughter at the sight of the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggling for altitude below. 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumbered upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight. To German pilots, accustomed to the sleek Spitfires and nimble Soviet fighters, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed too small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. What Herrmission didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror. Their .850 caliber Browning machine guns would become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. The transformation began that April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation positioning for attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran who had transferred from RAF Spitfires just weeks earlier understood what his men didn't yet know. Survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt represented a radical departure from conventional fighter design philosophy. While the Germans had pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and turn performance, Republic aviation had created something unprecedented. A high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, power, and firepower to redefine the rules of aerial warfare. Among the 56 American pilots spread across the French sky that morning were men who would become legends, future aces whose names would strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on April 8, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing the most experienced fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939, veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from a June 1940 panic. As German fighters swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was a monster that redefined the possible. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted to his design team, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who saw it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbo-supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked the same question: "This thing actually flies?" Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for air. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. It ground-looped on landing, torque-rolled on takeoff, and dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility, their controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, described his first flight. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. The P-47s couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 19s, couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 110s, couldn't match their nimble handling at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses: attacking from below, where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled; forcing turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower. Hauptmann Josef Prieler, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter: "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indiana, fat targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics seem to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans might reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. But something strange was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence failed to notice. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a liquid-cooled fighter cold. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early warfighters or the cannon with limited ammunition, the American fighter could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. The event that would begin changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Le Bourget, France. It involved Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron and an encounter that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict. Johnson's formation of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 19s from Jagdverschwader 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers, taking catastrophic damage in the first seconds of combat. 20 20-millimeter cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. The engine cowling was torn away. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg from shrapnel and bullet fragments, tried to bail out but discovered the canopy was jammed. A 20-millimeter shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, a barely functioning engine that shook violently, and controls that responded only intermittently, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that would have reduced any other fighter to falling debris. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unknown pilot from Jagdgeschwader 26, discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports from that day. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial warfare history. The German pilot positioned himself behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his 4 20-millimeter cannon and 2 13-millimeter machine guns. Johnson, unable to evade, could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load. Then the German repositioned and fired again, this time with only his machine guns, the cannon ammunition exhausted. He pulled alongside, staring in disbelief at the flying wreck. Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blond, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear. The German pilot repositioned himself and emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt. Still it flew. He pulled alongside again, shook his head in apparent amazement, gave an informal salute, and peeled away, presumably out of ammunition. Johnson's P-47 landed at Manston with its engine failing on the runway. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat. The engine had taken direct hits. The control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through, yet the aircraft had brought him home. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own creation. German intelligence, receiving combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 26, initially refused to believe it. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment. But testimony from multiple pilots confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had taken everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver, and survived. By July 1943, American pilots were learning to exploit the P-47's true strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander, had discovered the secret through brutal trial and error. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, initially seen as a disadvantage, became a weapon. In a dive, nothing could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in a vertical dive. This speed could be converted into altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind. Captain Walker Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic, though pilots called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could effectively operate. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, reaching speeds that made deflection shooting impossible for the defending Germans. At the bottom of these dives, the American heavy machine guns would speak. German pilots who survived described it as facing a wall of lead, the combined firepower creating an impenetrable zone of destruction. Aircraft caught in this convergence pattern didn't just fall, they disintegrated. The true revelation of American firepower came during the August 17, 1943 dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date. This mission would demonstrate both the P-47's limitations, its range even with drop tanks, and its terrifying effectiveness when employed properly. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyer aircraft, positioning to attack B-17s with their heavy cannon and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but less maneuverable, were the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Messerschmitt 110s who survived, later recounted in a prisoner of war interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters. Good hits. I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tail severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, a Messerschmitt 110 became nothing. 8 Messerschmitt 110s were destroyed in less than a minute. The German pilots had never experienced such concentrated firepower. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, weighing nearly 900 pounds. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 100 projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself was a revelation of American industrial capacity. While German fighters struggled with limited cannon ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds for a 20mm weapon, American pilots could maintain fire for over half a minute. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect. When you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw a 109 literally cut in half, the tail falling one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never knew what hit him. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude while German fighters suffered. The turbo-supercharged double-wasp engine maintained its rated power output up to 30,000 feet. German fighters relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers saw their performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen. Philipp found his Focke-Wulf A190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth.
When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were sitting ducks. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot on his way to ace status, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art. Johnson's combat report was clinical. Open fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Philipp's death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both eastern and western fronts, couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts, what chance did average pilots have? The German High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report delivered to Reich Marshal Hermann Göring in November 1943 was sobering. The Thunderbolt service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor included 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armored deflection plates around the engine. Most disturbingly, its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still return home. In January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from laughingstock to nightmare. The P-47D-22 featured a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades 13 feet in diameter, broad chord blades that bit into the air like massive oars. The improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration, allowing P-47s to build energy faster in level flight. Hauptmann Heinrich Knock of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. The distinctive thundering roar, created by the blade tips reaching supersonic speeds, could be heard from miles away. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone. A deep, threatening rumble that meant death from above. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried 208-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending range to over 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. The Luftwaffe's response was to concentrate on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign. But this required flying through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition.
German pilots developed a grudging respect that bordered on fear for the big American fighters. Major Günter Röhl, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him badly wounded. He later recalled in a post-war interview, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters. Just gone, transformed into burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death." The escort missions revealed another P-47 advantage: endurance. While German fighters operated at maximum power settings that consumed fuel rapidly, the big American radials could cruise efficiently at high altitude. Thunderbolts could remain with the bombers for hours, rotating top cover while maintaining enough fuel for combat and return. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over long-range escort duties in spring 1944, P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The transition began in earnest in April 1944 as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against ground targets. The standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles, while the sheer volume of fire could destroy soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst put 16 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the P-47 into a true multi-role monster. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist, 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them J-bows, fighter bombers, but these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, of Jagdgeschwader 2, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day, reported, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from our groupie. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." In the weeks following D-Day, P-47 systematically destroyed German movement in daylight. The statistics were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances. The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor, deployed more anti-aircraft guns, developed new camouflage techniques. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made them nearly unstoppable. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. While devastating Europe, The P-47 was simultaneously proving its worth in the Pacific theater. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea, discovered that the Thunderbolt's qualities were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed tactics specifically for the Pacific. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, shooting down 6 enemy planes himself in a single mission, earning him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters, were unprepared for the P-47's combination of firepower and durability. Japanese ace Saburo Saki, who encountered P-47s over New Guinea, later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart." The P-47N, developed specifically for the Pacific, featured increased fuel capacity with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, extending range to 2,350 miles. This variant would escort B-29s to Japan, proving that the short-legged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range weapon. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came in its encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, with its 540-mile-per-hour
Top speed should have been untouchable by propeller-driven fighters. But Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets in 2 situations: during takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, and in high-speed dives from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me-262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, fast enough to catch the jet in level flight. The jet pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never saw the diving P-47 until Meyer's guns opened up at 400 yards. Meyer's combat report noted, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fire of 8 50 caliber guns proved more effective than we anticipated against jet aircraft." By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed specifically to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection boosting power to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept even jets under certain conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47Ms, shot down 2 Me-262s in March 1945. His tactical report emphasized firepower over speed. "The jets are faster, but they can't turn and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery and they come apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack bombers. That's when we get them." The ultimate demonstration of American industrial might came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, including their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands.
At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially succeeded. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft. A captured German pilot brought to the command post pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking's response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hard stands for replacements. By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The German pilot's smirk disappeared. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47 D-40s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders. These losses they could never replace. The Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, all replaced within a week. The numbers told the story of inevitable defeat. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter. At peak production, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed one Thunderbolt every hour around the clock. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contained 2,400 individual components machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. The ammunition production was equally staggering. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition plants, produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through the synchronized gun mechanisms. The fuel consumption was enormous. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat with water injection engaged. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All of it shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that themselves were products of American mass production. Even more impressive than aircraft production was pilot training. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually from advanced training, more than Germany had trained in the entire war. Each P-47 pilot received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. German pilots, by contrast, were entering combat with less than 100 hours total time by war's end. The quality showed in combat. American pilots arrived in Europe trained in formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery, and tactics. They had practiced against captured German aircraft, understanding their enemy's capabilities and limitations. They knew their aircraft systems intimately, having studied technical manuals that German pilots never received. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage. I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47. I had fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from actual combat. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I faced couldn't have half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. In March 1945, Oberstleutnant Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials seeking to boost morale. His statement, deemed too demoralizing for publication, revealed the complete transformation in German attitudes. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter-bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose one, it's gone forever.
Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us, mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Airfields were cratered ruins. But even with aircraft and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible equation. Attacking meant facing P-47 formations that owned every altitude from ground level to 40,000 feet. Welding web Shiner Klaus Brettshiner, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly one combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded. The wings separated. I barely escaped. In the parachute, I watched them destroy my entire Staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. The psychological impact was complete. German pilots developed what medical officers called yabo fever, physical symptoms of stress appearing when P-47s were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops who knew that survival meant finding cover immediately. The final statistics of P-47 operations defied comprehension. In Europe alone, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. Another 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The ground attack missions were even more devastating. 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. In the Pacific Theater, the numbers told a similar story. 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives destroyed, countless barges, ships, and installations reduced to rubble by the Thunderbolt's guns. The 9th Air Force alone, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties. They dropped 120,000 tons of bombs. They fired 135 million rounds of ammunition. They launched 60,000 rockets. The Thunderbolt units achieved a 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber. Behind these numbers lay the human cost. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces. Many fell to the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training that Germany could never replace. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. At the Luftwaffe Interrogatory Center at Oberhörsel, captured Allied pilots were debriefed by German intelligence. The records captured in 1945 revealed German assessments of Allied aircraft. The file on the P-47, updated continuously throughout the war, showed the complete reversal of opinion. April 1943, large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed. Machine gun armament insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. Assessment, minimal threat. December 1943, exceptional high-altitude performance, extreme structural strength, firepower increasingly problematic, pilots showing improved tactics. Assessment, significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944, dominant fighter-bomber. superior to all German types above 20,000 feet, firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment: critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment: unsurvivable in direct engagement.
In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former adversaries met in peace. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His response, recorded on video, captured the complete transformation. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable. The visibility excellent. The controls precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. But what really impressed me was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced, yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns, we called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The P-47's design represented American industrial philosophy perfectly. Brute force engineering backed by unlimited resources. Every component was overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered. The wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. The control cables were doubled throughout, with automatic backup systems. The ammunition feed system alone was a marvel of engineering. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, fed through electric boost motors to prevent jamming during high G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each gun had its own charging mechanism and could be individually synchronized. The convergence was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards, allowing pilots to optimize for their preferred engagement range. Even after the war, some German veterans maintained that the P-47 won through quantity, not quality, that German fighters were technically superior, but overwhelmed by numbers. The combat records tell a different story. In engagements where numbers were equal, P-47s consistently prevailed. The heavy machine gun armament, dismissed as inferior to cannon, proved more effective in actual combat. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why. Cannon shells, while individually more destructive, required precise aim and had limited ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds total. The P-47's weapons created a probability cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits, even with imperfect aim. At typical engagement ranges, a 2-second burst put at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, enough to ensure destruction.
The ammunition itself was superior. American 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed-action fuse that ensured penetration before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure. German 20mm shells, while heavier, often exploded on surface contact, causing spectacular but sometimes superficial damage. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced.
Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. The transformation of German opinion from mockery to terror took less than 2 years. In that time, the flying milk bottle became the most feared aircraft in the Luftwaffe's experience. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of P-47s in hushed tones decades after the war. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Its placard lists specifications and battle honors, but the real story is told by a small display case containing spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America. The engineering philosophy behind the Thunderbolt deserves deeper examination because it represented a fundamental shift in how Americans approached military aircraft design. European fighters, both German and British, emphasized aerodynamic purity and minimal weight. Every component was scrutinized for potential weight savings. This philosophy created beautiful, nimble aircraft that handled like sports cars. The P-47 rejected this entirely. Alexander Kartvel's design team added weight deliberately. More armor, bigger guns, redundant systems. The result was an aircraft that weighed as much as a small bomber, but could dogfight when necessary and absolutely dominated at high altitude where the war was actually being fought. The turbo supercharger system that gave the Thunderbolt its high-altitude performance was itself a masterpiece of American engineering. The General Electric turbo supercharger used exhaust gases, normally wasted energy, to drive a turbine that compressed intake air. This allowed the engine to maintain sea-level power at altitudes where normally aspirated engines would barely run. The system was complex. Exhaust gases from the 18 cylinders were collected in a manifold and ducted to the turbine at the rear of the aircraft. The turbine spun at up to 25,000 revolutions per minute. The compressed air was then ducted forward to the engine through an intercooler that reduced its temperature, increasing density and power. German engineers understood turbo supercharging. They'd experimented with it before the war, but they couldn't make it reliable enough for combat use. The extreme temperatures and vibrations destroyed turbine blades. The ducting cracked. The seals failed. They abandoned the technology as too complex for field conditions. American metallurgists solved the turbine blade problem with new nickel alloys that could withstand 1,700-degree exhaust gases. American manufacturing produced precision castings that maintained tolerances at extreme temperatures. American quality control ensured that systems worked reliably in combat conditions that would have destroyed German equivalents. The result was that P-47s routinely cruised at 30,000 feet, where Luftwaffe fighters struggled to reach.
At those altitudes, the Americans had every advantage. They could see German formations below them. They could dive to attack with massive speed advantage. They could zoom climb back to altitude after attacking, leaving German fighters unable to pursue. German pilots who survived encounters with high-flying P-47s described the helplessness of fighting an enemy who controlled the vertical dimension. Major Heinz Noki wrote in his diary after a December 1943 engagement, "We climbed to intercept American bombers at 26,000 feet. P-47s attacked from above from 32,000 feet. We tried to climb to meet them with our engines were gasping. They dove through our formation, destroyed 4 of our fighters, and climbed away before we could react. We were like men trying to fight birds. They owned the sky above us." The P-47's armor protection was another area where American and German philosophy diverged dramatically. German fighters had minimal armor, maybe 8 to 14 millimeters of steel behind the pilot's head. The logic was that weight saved was performance gained. A lighter fighter was a more nimble aircraft. The P-47 had armor everywhere. 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot's seat and headrest, 1/4-inch plate on the sides, armored plates protecting the oil cooler, armored glass windscreen a full 1/2-inch thick that could stop 20-millimeter cannon shells. Total armor weight exceeded 200 pounds, more than the entire ammunition load of some German fighters. Robert Johnson's survival after being hit by over 200 rounds vindicated this philosophy completely. A Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 with that kind of damage would have disintegrated. The P-47 absorbed it and flew home. This meant American pilots who were hit had a chance of survival. German pilots who were hit usually died. Over the course of a long campaign, this survival rate differential became decisive. The psychological impact on pilots was profound. American pilots knew their aircraft would protect them. They flew aggressively, took calculated risks, pressed attacks because they trusted the Thunderbolt's armor. German pilots became increasingly cautious as they realized that any hit could be fatal. Cautious pilots don't win dogfights. Aggressive pilots who trust their equipment do. The P-47's gun armament deserves special attention because it represented the pinnacle of American heavy machine gun technology. The Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun was originally designed by John Browning in 1918 for anti-tank use. By World War II, it had evolved into perhaps the most reliable automatic weapon ever created. Each gun weighed 64 pounds and fired at 750 to 850 rounds per minute. The 50-caliber round itself was a masterpiece of ammunition design. At 710 grains weight and 2,900 feet per second velocity, it delivered over 13,000 foot-pounds of energy. For comparison, a modern big game rifle delivers about 4,000 foot-pounds. The armor-piercing incendiary round could penetrate 20 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. The incendiary compound ignited on impact, starting fires in fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, and aluminum structure. The tracer rounds allowed pilots to walk their fire onto targets. The standard ball ammunition was effective against unarmored targets. The convergence pattern was critical. P-47 armorers typically set gun convergence at 300 yards, meaning all 8 guns' bullet streams intersected at that range. At convergence distance, the pattern was devastating. Pilots described it as a saw blade. Anything that flew through the convergence zone was cut apart. The ammunition feed system was equally impressive. Each gun had its own 425-round ammunition box. The rounds were linked in belts that fed through flexible chutes to the guns. Electric boost motors assisted feeding during high-G maneuvers when gravity and centrifugal force could cause jams. The system was so reliable that gun stoppages were rare. When German pilots reported that American fighters seemed to fire continuously without pause, they were experiencing this reliability firsthand. The 6-gun armament of earlier American fighters had been adequate. The 8-gun battery of the P-47 was overwhelming.
German pilots who survived described being hit by what felt like a solid bar of metal. The combined fire of 8 guns created an almost continuous stream of projectiles. At maximum rate of fire, the P-47 put 100 rounds per second into the air. That's 1.6 rounds every hundredth of a second. To a target, it felt like being hit by everything at once. The rate of fire calculation reveals why this was so effective. In a 2-second burst, typical for aerial combat, the P-47 fired 200 rounds. Even with combat spread and deflection, 20 to 30 rounds would hit a fighter-sized target. Each hit transferred 13,000 foot-pounds of energy. 20 hits meant 260,000 foot-pounds delivered in 2 seconds. No aircraft structure could survive that kind of punishment. German fighters typically carried 2 or 4 cannon plus 2 machine guns. A Focke-Wulf 190 A8 with 4 20mm MG-151 cannon and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns had impressive paper firepower. But the cannon held only 175 rounds per gun. At 700 rounds per minute, that's 15 seconds of fire per gun. In practice, pilots fired in 1 to 2 second bursts, maybe 6 to 8 bursts before the cannon were empty. The P-47 could fire for over 30 seconds continuously before exhausting its ammunition. Pilots who tried to dogfight with Thunderbolts discovered that the American would still be shooting long after German guns ran dry. In a prolonged engagement, the P-47 simply outlasted its opponents through sheer ammunition capacity. The logistical implications of this firepower were staggering. Every P-47 mission required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. A typical fighter group of 75 aircraft flying 1 mission per day consumed over 250,000 rounds. That's 12.5 tons of ammunition daily. The 9th Air Force, operating hundreds of P-47s, consumed millions of rounds monthly. American industry supplied this without strain. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri covered 3,900 acres and employed 20,000 workers at peak production. They produced 50 caliber ammunition at rates exceeding 1 million rounds per day. Quality control was rigorous. Each round was inspected. Random samples were test-fired. Defect rates were measured in parts per million. This industrial capacity meant that American pilots never worried about ammunition shortages. They could fire liberally at ground targets, suppressing flak positions, destroying vehicles, without concerning themselves with conservation. German pilots, by contrast, were constantly aware of their limited ammunition. They had to make every shot count. This created hesitation that American pilots exploited ruthlessly. The contrast extended to training ammunition. American pilots in training fired thousands of practice rounds, learning to lead targets, judge deflection, and manage convergence. They arrived at combat units with extensive gunnery experience. German pilots by late war often received minimal gunnery training. Some arrived at combat units having fired fewer than 100 practice rounds. They learned to shoot in combat, if they survived long enough to learn at all. The P-47's evolution through the war demonstrated American ability to incorporate combat lessons rapidly. The original P-47C had good performance but limited range. The addition of external fuel tanks on the P-47D extended radius to 475 miles, then 1,000 miles with larger tanks. This transformed the Thunderbolt from a short-range interceptor to a long-range escort fighter. The paddle blade propeller on the P-47D-22 and later models improved climb rate by 35% and takeoff performance by 40%. This single modification eliminated one of the P-47's few remaining weaknesses. German pilots had exploited the Thunderbolt's slow initial climb by attacking during takeoff and landing. The paddle blade props made this tactic suicidal. The P-47M variant, optimized for speed, could reach 470 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. This made it competitive with German jets in certain flight regimes. The P-47N, with its increased fuel capacity and refined aerodynamics, had a range of 2,350 miles, enough to escort B-29s from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. Each improvement was implemented rapidly. From identification of a problem to fielding of a solution typically took 4 to 6 months. German improvements, hampered by production chaos and material shortages, often took years if they were implemented at all. The contrast in pilot training systems proved equally decisive. American pilot training in 1944 followed a systematic progression. Primary training in light aircraft lasted 8 to 12 weeks. Basic training in more powerful aircraft took another 10 weeks. Advanced training in operational types consumed 12 to 16 weeks. Total training time exceeded 1 year, with 400-plus flight hours before pilots reached operational units. The curriculum is comprehensive: formation flying, navigation, instrument flight, gunnery, tactics, aircraft systems, emergency procedures. Pilots practiced against other students in mock combat. They flew at night, in weather, over mountains and water. They learned to handle emergencies, recover from spins and stalls, and operate from limited fields. The result was that American pilots arriving in combat were thoroughly prepared. They knew their aircraft intimately. They could handle emergencies instinctively. They had practiced the tactics they would use in combat. Their gunnery skills, honed through hundreds of practice rounds, gave them a significant advantage in the brief, violent encounters that characterized aerial combat. German pilot training had been excellent in 1939 and 1940. Luftwaffe pilots received 2 years of training, including 250 hours of flight time. But as losses mounted and fuel became scarce, training was cut repeatedly. By 1943, new pilots arrived at combat units with 150 hours. By 1944, 100 hours. By 1945, some pilots reached operational units with fewer than 60 hours total time. The quality difference was stark. An American pilot with 400 hours had flown his aircraft in every conceivable situation and had practiced gunnery until hitting targets was instinctive. A German pilot with 60 hours was still learning basic aircraft handling. In combat, this experience differential was usually fatal. American pilots routinely shot down multiple German fighters on their first missions. German novices were often killed on their first or second combat sortie. The survival rates reflected this training disparity. American fighter pilots in Europe had approximately a 70% survival rate. 7 out of 10 pilots who entered combat survived the war. German fighter pilots faced a 25% survival rate by 1944. 3 out of 4 pilots who flew combat missions were killed. The mathematics of these survival rates guaranteed German defeat. Even if individual German pilots were superior, which they weren't by late war, the attrition rate was unsustainable. The industrial capacity to produce both aircraft and trained pilots faster than they could be lost gave America an insurmountable advantage. This was warfare as mathematics. Production rates times survival rates equals force strength over time. American rates were positive and increasing. German rates were negative and declining. The outcome was inevitable. The P-47's ground attack role deserves special attention because it was in this mission that the Thunderbolt truly earned its fearsome reputation among German ground forces. The transition from air superiority fighter to fighter-bomber was natural. The aircraft could carry significant ordnance. It was fast enough to avoid most flak, and its armor made it survivable in the face of ground fire that would destroy lighter aircraft. A P-47 configured for ground attack could carry two 1,000-pound bombs on wing racks plus a 500-pound bomb on the center line. Total bomb load of 2,500 pounds equaled many medium bombers. But unlike bombers, the P-47 could place these bombs with fighter accuracy. Dive-bombing attacks from 8,000 to 10,000 feet put ordnance within yards of targets. The addition of rocket rails transformed the P-47 into a tank killer. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket used shape-charge warheads that could penetrate armor. A full load of 10 rockets gave the P-47 firepower equivalent to a naval destroyer. German tank crews who survived rocket attacks described them as absolutely terrifying. The rockets screamed in flight, creating psychological impact before they even hit. But it was the .850 caliber guns that made the P-47 most feared by German ground troops. At low altitude, firing at ground targets, the convergence pattern created devastation unprecedented in previous wars. A 2-second burst put 200 rounds into a truck-sized target. Soft-skinned vehicles simply disintegrated. Even armored vehicles suffered, as bullets sparked off armor, destroyed external equipment, and killed crews through open hatches. The P-47 pilots developed specialized ground attack tactics. They would approach at low altitude, often below 500 feet, making detection difficult. The first indication German troops had of attack was often the thunder of the R-2800 engine and the saw blade sound of 8 guns firing. By then, it was too late to take cover. Strafing passes were typically made at 350 to 400 miles per hour. At that speed, the P-47 covered the length of a vehicle convoy in seconds. A 4-ship flight of Thunderbolts could destroy an entire convoy in one pass. They would attack in trail, each aircraft targeting different vehicles, creating a rolling barrage that left nothing.